cycles work, and it caused a lot of harm and damage to ecosystems, which in turn, of course, directly affects Indigenous communities and Indigenous communities' ability to practice these ceremonial traditions. So when we're looking at, rectifying the issues with water relationships in the present, what we have to understand is that our water relationships are something that are completely physiological to us as well, and how we understand our place in the ecosystem as not something that we're, living within, but something that we're always going to be completely integrated into the process of, right? And our entire sense of self, goes back to how water has shaped who we are in the regions that we're from. So if we look at, the geographic placement of various Indigenous tribes across the continent, or across the globe, rather, a lot of these community placements are informed by waterways and the shapes that rivers take. And so we followed rivers, we followed mountain ranges, we followed stars, and those all shaped how we got to our homelands and how we came to know who we are and what we're meant to do in these particular locations. And that's something important to carry forward, because there's a sense of ancestry embedded into the landscape. The landscape is an ancestor of ours because it informed how our culture is shaped and how our cultural practices were meant to be done. And if we look at Indigenous languages, Indigenous languages are they're verb-based, but they're also fractal in that you have elements that build on each other, and it's a very almost chemical way of speaking. And it's a way you can communicate with the landscape and understand your role in the landscape a little bit better. If we look at the Rio Grande, right, Patsalia, Turtle River, what we're looking at is the root word of the word turtle, and that first element is pa, which is water. And so the word turtle is built on the first element of what a turtle is, which is a being that lives in the water. And from there, you add on all these different elements to tell the entire story of what this being's relationship is to that landscape. And so when we're speaking in our traditional languages, we're also speaking in a way that tells an equation about how we know our place in these different regions. And so putting that all together, you have, a completely continuous relationship in every aspect of culture that is inseparable from the way the ecosystem takes care of itself.
Okay, Marissa.
Excellent. So the part that I might build on is the idea that the land and the river remember us, even throughout these eras of history, when we forget, right? Like we as little humans might forget. And so there's parts of the work that I've looked at that have to do with collective remembering and collective forgetting, and how many generations does it take for us to forget? And part of what I was paying attention to is just that having family in Laredo, Texas, where there are sister cities similar to here in El Paso, where it's El Paso and Juarez, we have Laredo y Nuevo Laredo, they're sister cities. And that relationship predates colonization. It's been one thriving mutual interdependence for so many generations. But in the short time that I've been aware, in my 40-year lifespan, that relationship has been interrupted in my hometown. Whereas as soon as I talk to my great aunties during holidays and they talk about being able to cross and not having to necessarily need papers, how absolutely militarized and difficult that relationship has become. Whereas in high school, it was common to have houses on both sides, and people lived on both sides and commuted to both directions, and there wasn't as fraught a relationship. It's only recent that the conversations about militarizing the border have really interrupted this beautiful relationship. And so part of what I was looking at with the collective remembering and collective forgetting had to do with what's my role as an educator, because all the way down to it at the granular level, I'm a middle school teacher. I work with young people. And one of the most refreshing parts of adolescence in particular is that they do not have any of the petrified, hardened assumptions that we do as adults, all of us in this room straight up. They don't have the same patterns of thinking. They don't take in the same kind of media. They're completely open and malleable and fresh, and they're formulating who they are and what their place is in the world. And it felt like a really necessary intervention to be able to figure out how we might really listen to the relationships that we have in our local ecosystems and the traditional knowledge that our elders still carry. And in a way, excavate through these layers of colonial knowledge to figure out how we might be able to really pay attention to what they need to know about living where they are, right? And having been a middle school teacher and being a teacher educator now and understanding all of the complications of our heavily surveilled career that people make decisions on who may or may not have children, who may or may not have a real investment in public education, and folks that have other agendas that impose on education, and what teachers are able to do as professionals in the classroom. What I really wanted to capture was the notion that whether folks have a tribal membership or not, whether they understand their personal ancestries or not, we can still understand a relationship to the land. And so getting back to the notion of water management, without using the term water management, how might I take a group of 13-year-olds to the banks of the river and talk to our local elders about what used to be here before the wall, before the levee, before the infrastructure, before they shut down our public parks and our public fishing areas? Where did our elders learn to swim? Where did our elders go before there was plumbing? Where did our elders go where that particular ganya grew, where they knew their plant relatives? Those were the questions that I was interested in. And so how do we bridge the gap between what our elders know and what our young people are ready to learn? Because sometimes the most important science knowledge, especially as a science teacher, is not what you find in the textbooks. It's what you find by walking on the land and walking with the river and being around as a being, as a relation in these ecosystems where we live. And so when we're thinking about lifelong learning, how might we also influence what science teachers do in the classroom and really making things not only culturally relevant and culturally sustainable, but inclusive across all of the kids that might be in some of our urban classrooms? Some who do know their genealogies, some who don't, some who are connected to culture, some who aren't. How can we still make what they bring relevant to the conversation? So the notion of water management then, it's a forward-facing idea of being a relation rather than looking back at, for example, some of the policies that are hundreds of years old that haven't been updated to reflect who we are contemporarily as as a mixed community, as water becomes more scarce, and really understanding that it's not a commodity, even though it's been encoded in law as a commodity. It's a sacred being. It is the life that brings life to all of us. We share this. And so really trying to redefine how our young people might take up notions of what water management means, but not in a way that is prescriptive, instead in a way that invites them to be curious and to follow their own questions and to have strategies for finding answers, both in the way that we are all reliant on technology today, but also in fundamentally cultivating relationships with our community elders. Yeah.
Wow, these are some big ideas. Water management could be a legalism, could be technology, but from an Indigenous perspective, it's more about relationship and relationship to the water and to the earth. Ceremony, spirituality, connection of the groundwater, the sky water, the water in ourselves. These are major things. Maybe you want to translate this a little bit into the Rio Grande itself, the Rio Grande, the Rio Bravo itself. How is that waterway an entry into these collective memories? Lives, source, wild, is it sacred? How does that work for you? Do you want to start on that, Marisa?
Sure. So it comes from a very personal place. The Rio Grande is absolutely sacred. Knowing, and maybe I'll start this way, knowing my genealogies and understanding my relatives that are different tribal relations, but not being a tribal member, right, puts me in a precarious situation when I'm speaking to folks in the US. And one of the things that I learned is that when I got to Canada for my graduate studies, they don't have the same hangups that I necessarily have to be a tribal member to understand Indigenous knowledge. when I say to them, I had a really vibrant childhood, a ceremonial life, and I had grandmothers, elders who mentored me. And this is what I learned. It shifts the conversation in some really important ways, right? And so really understanding how we are relations to each other also. So thinking about the river as a sacred place, part of what I know is from the lived experience of my own ceremonial life, of the elders who would come internationally to Laredo as a place where we would celebrate a ceremony called Canto la Tierra that intentionally invited elders from across Turtle Island to have conversations about how we might move forward in good relations. Thinking about what it means both as the border that I grew up on and understanding the really rich fluidity and dynamics of the sister cities and not being on one side or the other, and understanding it goes back to the cosmography, how teachings inform the way that the universe then is oriented in everything that I do. And then having the opportunity to travel and to live other places. And whereas in Laredo, Texas, we don't have a wall, but military boats with machine guns welded on the front are commonplace. They patrol the river every half hour. And even though there is recreation, like fishing outside of the city limits, and people do kayak recreationally, it's so heavily surveilled. And to have the complete opposite experience in moving to Canada, where I drove a U-Haul across the Peace Arch at Blaine, Washington. And it's a beautiful park with manicured gardens and warm running water in the bathrooms. And there are wedding parties taking their official photographs all over the international crossing place between the US and Canada. And it boggled my mind because my experience as a fronteriza is so different here or in Laredo, where I'm from, compared to what life looks like in those international borders. And so really calling back to not only what are the contexts that make things complicated, but really understanding and trying to, again, that word excavate, right? Unearth all of the layers and the rhetorics of militarization and border and get down to what the earth remembers. What do I know that my DNA is here in these places? That's older memory. And so in those ways is how I would understand the river as the sacred place. And to other Indigenous peoples, for example, from Maori relatives, I learned that you can identify by your river or by your mountain, and that orients you geographically and relationally as to where other people understand each other. And in that practice, being able to say, the Rio Grande is my ancestral river from the lower valley of the Rio, it's worked in being able to kind of position myself and understand my relatives upstream and my relatives downstream, and really reinforcing the notion that it's a longitudinal journey rather than the conversation of the border, crossing the border in a different direction, really understanding the relationships all along the river. That's where I think there's life. That's where strength is.
Yeah. So I think I'll start by telling an anecdote about the Rio Grande, and from there we'll see where it goes. But in 1911, of course, they began and built the Elephant Butte Dam, right, which is just in Tier C, and that was a moment of a misguided forces coming into the landscape and destroying the river and essentially taking millions of years of natural processes and interrupting them, right? When you think about how many magnificent powers have to conspire together to form the shape of the river, it really starts telling a poetic story of the landscape, right? Because the shape of the river takes so many millions of years to come to what it is. And in the matter of a few years, when they built the Elephant Butte Dam, that was completely obstructed. And they destroyed the river and they channeled the river. So they straightened it down here. And it completely changed the entire landscape of the borderlands. I mean, this area, we still have some vestiges of the grasslands that were part of this landscape, but this area used to be a lush grassland with marshy pockets along the river, alluvial deposits where cottonwood trees would grow, right? This was a place where bald eagles used to migrate to, right before they severed the river. It was called the Turtle River because, believe it or not, there used to be a lot of turtles in the river, but all of that got completely destroyed when the Elephant Butte Dam was created. And I share that anecdote because I think it says a lot about how much time it really takes to understand, for the land to really understand what humans are called to do in the landscape. And by that, I mean the river was here before us, right? The salt beds were here before us, the mountains were here before us, and yet they all play a critical role in our cultural development. And so they're ancestors that precede us coming into this region, and they work with us to be co-agents in the natural process of ecological expression. And having a river that's been completely destroyed and severed takes away so many people's original relationship to that river. When we have a misguided relationship to water in a desert landscape, it has repercussions that are so detrimental to all communities living here in the area, right? When people don't know what a healthy landscape looks like, it becomes, just an invitation for exploitation and for mismanaged relationships and for abuse of resources and so on. And so in a singular event, what you have is a completely shifted ecoregion here in the borderlands where for thousands of years we had a healthy eco-spiritual connection to place. And now what we're trying to do is address the issue of what took millions of years is now something that we're contending with the destruction of. And it's a really interesting and specific relationship to this region because, the borderlands region is already a politically contentious area. And now that we add, the conversation of water relationships into that equation, it starts to get really murky, no pun intended. And it's something that I think that needs a lot of attention because our original relationships to water are dependent upon the water being healthy in the first place itself, right? And when you have I think, speaking to a lot of the conversation around, the cartographical relationships to water that were brought up, it disorients people completely. Our entire way of orienting ourselves within the universe is based on how we know the world around us. When we have directional markers that are, the mountains or the rivers, and you change the landscape's manipulated, you all of a sudden have a complete psychological disorientation in the landscape. And that's why we have the issues we have in the borderlands with, culture and identity and so on. These are all related to the destruction of one of our most important relatives, which is the river, the thing that gives us all life. And, our relationship to the river is both, like I said, practical and transcendental. I mean, it's something that serves a ceremonial purpose, a cleansing purpose, serves a metaphorical purpose. And the flow of water through the seasons teaches us what it means to move forward towards whatever force is pulling us through. And when you have something like a river, which is both something that's constant and changing, and you have something coming in, an outside force coming in and changing that narrative, then you have a complete narrative shift of who the people are and what the relationship is supposed to be.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was also going to talk about the Elephant Butte Dam, but I think that just says what a significant development that was for our community and for the Borderlands region throughout, what is now New Mexico and Texas. But I guess I'll start with a different anecdote now too. So I know this last year, the stretch of the Rio Grande that runs through Albuquerque, which usually flows year round, went dry for the first time in maybe 40, 50 years. It was a really significant incident. You know, people were scrambling to like try and save a lot of the endangered fish that live in that section of the river. I know a lot of people, a lot of my family in Albuquerque, it was just a really shocking visual representation of the climate impacts that we're experiencing here. And I think what a lot of people, you know, our relatives up north don't realize is that, you know, in Las Cruces, we live without a flowing river basically all year round until they do, you know, releases from the Elephant Butte Dam. And Las Cruces, as an area like Diego was saying, that once was this very lush area, you know, our people are turtle people because of that relationship with the river. The city of Las Cruces doesn't actually draw any water from the Rio Grande anymore. It services all of its people through groundwater. So it doesn't even have access to the river anymore. And it's just, you know, we just had our spring ceremonies this last weekend, and it's so interesting because a lot of our ceremonies involve, you know, going to the river, gathering culturally significant plants, and, you know, we're still doing those things, but now we're doing it in a dry riverbed. So I think there's a lot of questions, like Diego was saying, about how does that change our relationship to the land? How does that change our relationship to culture and ceremony, and that continuity between practices that we have done since time immemorial that have now been disrupted because of this sudden change to the river ecosystem. So I think, speaking, I guess you all have covered a lot of ground. I'll speak a little bit to some of the legal repercussions, but some of you might know that Texas and New Mexico are currently litigating, right, over New Mexico's responsibility to deliver water from the Rio Grande to Texas, and settlement discussions failed in the fall. So now everyone's moving forward with litigation, which is going to be much more costly, take a much longer time for everybody. But I think the problem with these rigid legal systems that we work within, that I know we're going to talk more about prior appropriation, I think later in the panel, but how do we work within a rigid legal system where water rights are fully apportioned beyond what is available, when in a future of climate change, those water resources are going to be shrinking even further? I think we're going to be facing some really significant questions in the future about how do we first ensure that, you know, tribal nations have water settlements and have access to water rights that they have been prevented from accessing and using for, you know, sometimes over 100 years unjustly. And how do we, as people who live in this watershed and rely on this water, how do we equitably apportion a river that is continuing to shrink? So I don't pretend to have the answers to those questions, but I think that culturally, those are questions that a lot of Indigenous communities in this region are grappling with, and something obviously that impacts everyone here.
I'm thinking Will Rogers' statement, the Rio Grande is the only river he ever saw that needed irrigation. Can you talk about that, Nia? Well, that's an interesting, I didn't realize you didn't get any surface water in Las Cruces, so it's entirely groundwater. So the Rio is not a source of life water, except indirectly through groundwater. And then there's the memories of children in the river, and teaching children about the river and how you put that against current militarization of the border and what that means to us. So maybe that leads us into another question here. It's like, how do you conceive of the river as life or as identity, given these kinds of militarization, the constant surveillance, militarized boats going up and down the river? We have helicopters here. There's no river to go up and down anymore. So you know, how do you conceive of the river as life then? When life has been so segmented by these kind of artificial institutions and institutional arrangements. You want to start with that, Marissa?
Sure. Because no institution can tell me who I am. How do I understand it as part of identity? Because the land knows who I am, and because I was taught by elders who loved and nurtured me, and because culturally, yeah, there's no colonial institution that's going to re-identify who I am or how I feel in relation to the places where, like I said, I know that my DNA exists on the banks in and around Laredo, Texas. The other part of it, though, is that it's within the colonial framework to erase identity. Because when people don't know who they are, they're more easily manipulated. And so part of what I think is important, even especially as an educator, is leaving room for students to express what they know and what they bring and what they contribute. Because at the end of it, the question that I find myself asking over and over again is a question that lots of Indigenous educators ask is, whose knowledge is valued? Why are these institutions only built on colonial bodies of knowledge? How do we make space from within this beast to engage and to celebrate and to honor, right, these other bodies of knowledge? And so I am fully implicated within the system, but I am also fully responsible for making space as much as I can so that the ancestral knowledge that each of my students brings is honored and validated, and there's room. There's room for these multiple bodies of knowledge to speak to each other. But at no point do colonial institutions tell me who I am based in my identity. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think so.
Yeah, man, I think I had a different answer, but now that I'm inspired by that answer, I feel like there's so much terrain we can cover in this. Yeah, identity is such an interesting thing because I think the othering of Indigenous identity is kind of a really laughable farce because like indigeneity is kind of the way to live within your environment, right? Indigeneity became an othered concept, you know, within the creation of non-indigeneity, right? So indigeneity precedes everything that's non-indigenous. And now we're looking at indigeneity as this kind of fringe identity outside of what most people see as normal, which is an inversion of the global reality we were called into, right? Indigeneity is not something that exists outside of normalcy. Indigeneity is something that precedes the deviation from land-based relationships. And so when we talk about the conversation of identity, I think, you know, political indigeneity is something that was created basically to ontologically other people that no one knew what to do with, right? And that's kind of where we're coming at indigeneity from. And indigeneity is a really, really complex identity thing because it transcends what we understand to be race or ethnicity or those other like colonial parameters of what most people identify within, right? Indigeneity is something that is not strictly ethnic. It's not strictly, you know, phenotypical, right? It's something that is totally about relationship and kinship. And that's not defined within normal parameters of identity. And so when we think about identity based on relationships to water or landscape, you know, places in the landscape or other features in the landscape, what we're talking about is how there has been you know, millennia-long relationship between the people of a region and those features in the landscape. And that's where the mutual identity formation comes from. And so you have a place like the river, which has long been, you know, something that has been shaping the people of this region in a way that allows for people to have an identity in this place. And so, it's not that Indigenous identity is attached necessarily to the river, but that the identity is mutual in that relationship between, regions and everything that exists in that region, seen and unseen, right? You have all of the other relatives and beings that live in an ecosystem, right? Animals and plant life and so on. And then you have the unseen forces that are, consciously encoded in our ceremonial life ways in which we have to conduct ourselves. And that's something that is important to understand about, identity. Because I think a lot of people, really see identity through the lens of mere race science a lot of the time. And that undermines what it truly means to have an Indigenous relationship to a place that, is both ceremonial, practical, and familial. So you have, something like when people ask about indigeneity and the importance of, understanding Indigenous ceremonial life ways, it's about understanding how the best homeostasis has been maintained and how to carry those values forward to ensure the best environment for everyone who's sharing those locations. Because ceremony, a lot of people look at ancestry and they find these little windows for it, right? If we look at like the Puebloan world, it's like, whatever 900 to 1100 AD, whatever they say, right? And that's just a small window of that particular anthropological identity, right? But if we look at who we are in the bigger picture, it's like we go all the way back to that force of creation that began everything, right? We can trace our ancestry far back through the landscape of time and memory to something beyond even knowing human parameters. And I think that understanding indigeneity is understanding our place in that entire chain. I'm like going into your guys' space now, or that entire unbroken chain. And so the reason I, always mention prayer in my bio and stuff is because, I'm a full-time artist, and so I can say what I want in my bio, but also because, prayer is that connection point that opens up the door through time for us. If we think about the way we pray now, it's something that is connecting us all the way through the prayers of the past in whatever language they are spoken through time back to that first source of emanation. And so when we talk about our point of origination and where we draw our original instruction from or our inspiration for cultural practice from that reflects the greater reality, what we're doing is acknowledging our entire ancestral landscape and our entire existence as beings. And so I think identifying indigeneity within Western models is it's humanizing in the way that it only emphasizes the humanness of that kinship relationship and doesn't look at how our role as people for now is to completely be connected to all living things that share our ecosystem and by extension the universe with us, and finding the best kinship model within that.
Trying to think of what I can add to all of this good information. I think the river holds so much memory for us. Our community, the Piramansatewa tribe, is a confluence of those three communities, right? I think about my family, which is more predominantly Tiwa. My ancestors were brought after the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. My ancestors were brought south, right, to the Paso del Norte region. I think about every time I do that drive between Las Cruces and Albuquerque, I think about how, my ancestors followed the river south. The river connects our ancestral homelands between north and south. And even living in Las Cruces now, spending time on, there's still pathways on either side of the river, and you can actually go down and walk in the river banks. And even though the river is not flowing now, there's still that groundwater subflow that is enabling some of the wetland plants like willow, some cottonwoods to be able to continue to grow on the banks anyway. So there's like a deep memory of the river that's still present that hasn't been fully erased yet. And when I think about indigeneity and Indigenous identity, you often hear Indigenous people talk about time in terms of the next 7 generations, right? Like, I think if we think about our individual lifespans as compared to our connection to source, right, to time immemorial, our lifespans are quite short. And I hope that in our lifetimes that we do see some restoration of the river, of the Rio Grande. I know that compared to scales like time immemorial, things like the Elephant Butte Dam, most dams only have a functional lifespan of usually 50 to 100 years maximum. So I think we also have to remember that, the things that we have built and altered as humans are also impermanent. And I think it helps me when I feel sad about the changes and kind of start to feel hopeless about some of the climate impacts that we're facing in our generation. I think it helps me to think about scale on an Indigenous scale instead, to think about 7 generations. The dam is here now, but it won't be there forever, and the river still remembers where it flowed before.
Thank you. Colonization is when somebody else imposes a control system over you. And so from what Diego said about continuity extending from the past and the future and the relationship to the land, colonization is when that gets disrupted by an outside power, and even to the point of like giving you a name, categorizing you racially and in other ways. It's a disconnection from land and nature, or enforced in disconnection. In the Sierra Club, we have as a mission to protect, preserve, and enjoy wilderness. And we've colonized wilderness because there's actually a legal definition. I think it's in the Environmental Protection Act of what wilderness is. There's a contemporary philosopher whose work I follow, Charles Eisenstein. And Charles talks about the importance of wilderness by saying wilderness is where the earth remembers what it was like to be healthy. And that's why you need to protect the wilderness area. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and ask a question about the role of Indigenous people in this. Excuse me. Are Indigenous people how the earth remembers what it's like to be human? And I hope that doesn't insult anybody, but I just had to ask that. Are you, in your lives, in indigeneity, and that continuity you have, and that relationship to the earth, and as Diego said, groundwater to the sky water, water in us, is that what it means to be human? Have we forgotten that? Have we been colonized by industrial and capital and isms and everything else, so that we've been cut off from what it means to be human? And there's still a group of people around who maybe can teach us that.
I can
I'm going to
start.
give that to Diego.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
He's the one who prays.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I'm happy starting that one. So I think in my first response, I mentioned a lot of things, I guess, but I mentioned how we're kind of interpretive forces in the ecosystem. And so I'm going to break that down a little bit. Obviously, we have this really strange capacity for language. And when I say language, I reference, expression in all types of communication. And so like we have these really otherwise arbitrary sounds that we can make, that we can organize and have a synesthetic relationship to. They're more ideaesthetic, I guess, in that we can take these sounds and through our organization of these sounds, create ways to communicate with one another what we think inside of ourselves or what we experience outside of ourselves or within ourselves. And that's something that is unique to being human, this really strange capacity for communication and linguistic expression, dance, art, music, what have you. And so all these elements come together in ceremony and prayer to do just that, to be forces of powerful communication, both didactically within the community and as an offering within the ecosystem. So I like this question a lot because I think, without getting too much into, our bizarrely inexplicable synesthetic relationship to language, what we can understand about being human is that we have a responsibility to, use our perspicacity in communication to be the best agents of, ecological awareness we can be. And so by being balance keepers in our ecosystem, like, there is a purpose to dancing and singing and conducting ceremony beyond the mere aesthetics of it, right? These forces of communication have an organization to them that, albeit, is pretty mystical. And when I use the word mystical, I'm just referencing, the mystical experience is those moments of sensory and supersensory integration with that which is beyond perception, right? And we have an ability to tap into that with our faculties of expression and communication. And that's something that we are beholden to within our ecosystem, because we are the ones that can do that. And so being human within an ecosystem and being an eco-spiritual agent is all about utilizing those faculties for the greater efficiency and healthy expression of that ecosystem itself. And so that question is really, really good, because I think, like, remembering being human is about remembering our responsibility to actually be human. And that responsibility is about incorporating all of these uniquely human things we have for the purpose of ensuring what's best. And there's humanity is a weird thing too, because, like Mia said, there are, the Elephant Butte Dam is a small blip in the time scale. Humanity is also a small blip in the time scale, right? And so, indigeneity is something that is inherently eschatological, right? We're looking at remembering a human life post-apocalyptically almost. And we're looking at remembering our human interaction within a landscape through the lens of eschatology, which is a bizarre experience. It's a very, very strange thing to have to do. And so we're understanding both the past and the future at once. It's eschatological and anachronistic, right? You're taking all these time scales and merging them into one experience. And it's something that we have to understand, because I think there's this real strange human phenomena, and I might be going on a big tangent here, but there's this strange human phenomena, like, known as, like, the nostalgia for,
This is a place for
nostalgia for paradise. Right. I'm gonna let it go out there, and maybe someone will have a question about it. But the nostalgia for paradise, which is that, like, when points in human history, when things go wrong, people tend to look back at the last point they thought someone had it right. And so you see this in, like, the Middle Ages, when they're looking at, like, Egypt and the Hermetic tradition and the mystery schools and all this stuff. And then in the Renaissance, they're looking at the Greeks. They're like, no, those Greeks had it right, right? And now we're looking at, ecological destruction. And I think the rest of the world is like, oh, native people. That was the last point in our human story where people had it right. And so, invoking the past is, at this point, more about, bringing forth the best possible future for everyone than it is about recreating the past. Because the past is something that, no matter what, we can't bring it back. The things that have been done. And our cultural preservation is about pulling those best parts of who we were forward into the future. And so remembering indigeneity is not merely for remembering our humanness, but it's so that we can call upon those values and those principles of what it means to be human that our ancestors had, that were time tested, that worked. And we could say, okay, let's bring this forward and show the world how to be the best possible world we can be from our perspective, and show what our values do to ensure that we can make this a healthy place for everyone to live.
Mm-hmm.
Teresa, you have something to say on that?
Mia, do you have any ideas prepared?
Yeah, sure, I do.
I'm nebulous. Give me a minute.
Yeah, that was a lot to take in. No, I totally agree with I think that concept of like longing for the past is something that's so important and so present in a lot of our communities, because I think, you know, we all still experience so much grief, I think, for what has been taken. You know, many people in our community were impacted by removal and boarding schools, and that's, you know, pretty recent history too. Our grandparents, our great grandparents, sometimes our parents, depending on the generation. I think when you're grieving for something that's been lost, I think it's really natural, like Diego said too, to want to look back to who we were before we experienced colonization, and to kind of idealize that time. And I think that's a totally natural response, but also important for us to remember that, you know, there's no such thing as perfection. And even before colonization, our communities were experiencing hardship, we're changing. Change is constant. You know, I think I love the Octavia Butler quote that, you know, everything we touch, we change. Everything, anyone got it? Everything that touches us changes us. Anyway, change is constant and inevitable. And I think it's such an important reminder, like Diego said, to just focus on that continuity, pulling the things that made us who we are from the past, taking the best of that into the future with us. And just to respond to something else in that question, I think maybe one role of Indigenous people in the modern times can be to actually challenge the very concept of wilderness. I think that wilderness is kind of inherently a colonial concept because it's predicated on the idea that humans are separate from nature. A lot of areas that we consider to be wilderness, like national parks, only exist as they are today because Indigenous people were forcibly removed from those areas. Mm-hmm. So I think maybe one element of what it means to be human and what we can remember is, again, this, we've all touched on this several times already in this panel, is just the idea that we're not separate from nature, and to build our lives and our societies as though we are separate enables a lot of environmental destruction and a lot of consequences that we're all living with today.
I totally agree. And I wrote down the question. It is a really rich question. And so I was sitting here just kind of looking at the question and thinking about disrupting the notion that humanity is hierarchical on top of nature. That's built into the question almost, because if we were to reword the question so that it reads, is prioritizing native species how the earth remembers what it means to be a cottonwood tree? Sure. But it's not any different from any other being, right? And so it's also the difference between thinking in English, which is bounded by rules and particular concepts and all of the formulas that we use to construct our ideas, versus how it's relayed in any of our ancestral languages, which is different because the entire universe is oriented differently. And so speaking to those ancestral languages that are based in relationship of the locality where we live would give it a slightly different resonance, or maybe an understanding. But I really love this notion of synesthesia as an example. So for those who may not be fully aware, or maybe it's a new word, which is, of course, for elementary school children, probably in about the kindergarten level, first grade level, we talk about differentiating the 5 senses as though there are only 5. The 5 senses being seeing, hearing, tasting, touching. Seeing, hearing, tasting, touching. Smelling. And most children orient toward those 5 senses as though that is all. But really, humans are capable of about 50 different senses. We have a sense of time, a sense of an upright orientation, a sense of forward and backward, and depending on which language we're thinking in, because it's not even the spoken parts, but the language that formulates how our thoughts arise. Time doesn't always look like a line. Sometimes time is a circle, time is the Big Bang that's continuously banging. Time is collapsed past, present, future, and prolepsis. Time can be wherever liquid water is present and no other time exists. Time can be oriented to the cardinal directions of where the sun moves, because how could we possibly think that time is oriented to our human bodies? There's all different kinds of ways of understanding our relationship to the universe outside of the English language that would also disrupt this notion that the earth remembers humans as though we were somehow a prioritized being in all of this creation. And so I just want to pay attention to some of the limits of language and the really beautiful ways that other languages capture what's in our blind spots, because we're thinking and speaking, because I'm thinking and speaking in English primarily. But it's a rich question that's going to stay with me for a long time. Is indigeneity how the earth remembers what it means to be human? If we look at the oral histories of how people have told their creation stories, this isn't the only creation, right? Creation has happened, depending on who you ask, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times. There are previous iterations that the earth created and collapsed and created and collapsed. And the earth is constant and humankind has come and gone, depending on how you understand these different oral traditions. And so there's also something to be said of, it's what we remember that's mapped onto the earth, but the earth has a much longer memory that we might not be aware of. It might be also in our blind spot.
This got pretty deep. I actually have another deep question, but first, I want to make sure that our guests here have a chance to speak and have a chance to ask their questions of you. So we'll throw it open to Q&A, and I got plenty more questions. Don't worry, we'll get through that.
What do you all
Anything to
got?
ask our panelists?
What is it that you miss most about the past?
Ooh,
Oh.
that is a great question.
That you can remember, say as a child or a young, what is it that you miss most that you haven't gone back to it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I also want to thank our tribal member and elder Robert and his son Isaiah for coming to this panel. They're 2 tribal members of ours, and so they have a lot of knowledge to share on this topic as well. And I appreciate that question coming from Robert, because I know that his memory of our tribal ways, it runs deeper than ours, right? You know, where he's twice our age at this point, if not more, and he has a memory of the landscape in the river that's older than ours. And so I think that is a really appropriate question. And the first answer that came to mind was just, oh gosh, I think a lot about how I was really inspired to do a lot of this work when my grandfather passed away. And one of the first memories I have of my grandfather was teaching me actually a dance that I don't think we do anymore. So my grandfather actually grew up right down the street from Robert's family on San Pedro Street in Las Cruces. Our family still has that house. It's in our original tribal neighborhood. And back then, they called it the Barrio de los Indios before they called it the Mesquite Historic District, right? And they also called it the Arroyo because there's a big arroyo that ran through that area of the city. And your family house and the Cordero house and our family house were all built, the Roybal house were all built facing east and west because the neighborhood used to flood. And so they'd have to open the back door and open the front door and let the water flow through the house when the floods would come. Speaking of water, you know, and I think that was always such an interesting story to hear growing up. And it really hit me, all these stories that my grandfather shared, you know, where the springs were, what kind of wild fruits and vegetables they used to go pick up. And the width of the river changes every time, but sometimes it was 5 miles wide, the floodplain, sometimes it was 9 miles wide. Like all these things these stories that would be shared. And I think when my grandfather passed away and then his brother passed away, years back, all of these stories and memories started coming forward to me. And that's when I was really inspired just to internally catalog all of them, right? I'm thankful that I have a good, capacious memory that I can store a lot of these stories, although people are always like, you should write them down. But, I have a lot of these stories that were shared with me from my grandfather. And they're stories that, I've heard since I was, had developed the ability to interpret language for myself. And they're things that I never really understood because a lot of them were spoken esoterically or cryptically. A lot of them were spoken in song or in code, but I always remember the way my grandfather would talk about the land. He even wrote a book about what the city looked like and how it was oriented based on, 3 mountains and all the different, family stories, family secrets, all those things. And I think that is one of the things that, for me, it's weird to have had this, person when I was younger that I could have gone and asked more to, that, up until my adulthood, I didn't really realize it, how important it was to ask more, because he shared a lot with me, a lot about the river and family stories and stuff that when I was 8, I guess I took for granted. I didn't really think it mattered much. And now that we're in a point where, in our tribe, we have a few elders that are in their 90s that, are, their health is in question. And we have a lot of elders, that are in their 80s and 70s and stuff. And we're at a point of a lot of history and knowledge and stuff just going with it. When so much language and so much story passes on when an elder passes on, and it really, I don't want to say it bothers me, but thinking about all the questions I probably could have asked my grandpa when he was telling me these things that I didn't, it's one of those things where I'm like, dang, that was a real missed opportunity.
Just the idea of elder and what that means, someone who holds space for things to happen rather than necessarily being the one who's creating it.
Yeah.
That's completely gone from our society. We're senior citizens now, me, chronologically changed. So, I mean, just that is what I mean when you say something like that creates a space that you have that we don't have in city council and need. Thank you, Robbie. Do any of the other panelists have anything to say about that question?
Go ahead.
I would just build on that. The notion that elder is also a witness, and that's a sacred role, to be a witness, right, for a long period of time. And so they are the living archives because they remember and they can give testimony of how things were. And so there's something around being able to build intergenerational conversations that I think we need to focus on. So it's easy to be distracted by all of the other things, right, that keep us distracted. But it's definitely something that I think is important, especially as we try to redefine this new era in education, especially. The pandemic caused all of our kids to be connected to tech more than in the past. Young children, especially 2nd grade, 3rd grade, they missed out on writing because they were dragging and dropping. And so fine motor skills are lacking right now. They also missed out on relationally being able to get along and have disagreements and figure out good ways of finding peace on the playground. So it's not just a matter of how have things changed over the long term. It's also really paying attention, I think, to the pandemic and the fact that we're all trying to recover from this global tragedy where we lost huge numbers of people And there is so much mourning that's a recent mourning, right? And so how do we also remember how to be with each other in a good way today, right now, coming out of this and facing all kinds of new health crises because of the climate disaster, because of the impending shortages of water that we'll all face. And so, but what do I miss? This, maybe it's less personal. It's what do I hold nostalgia for that I might point back to? The idea that we are human beings, and it's enough to just be a being. It's enough to just be. I don't have to be a human doing, a human busy, a human exhausted. I can be just be. That's a thing that I'm allowed to do. I miss that. Maybe that's part of childhood that I'm nostalgic for. Drive me places and feed me good things. And I have to thank the host committee for doing exactly that, but there's something around, it's okay to be bored. It's okay to be unoccupied. It's okay to have time to sit outside and listen to the birds. There's something about the being part that I'm nostalgic to recapture.
Yeah. I'll share a short story too. I don't know how we're doing on time, but Robert, I don't know if I told you before, but my mom and my grandparents, my mom grew up in Tularosa, and that's where a lot of my, closer extended family lives. And I have so many really sweet memories of being there as a little girl. And my grandparents had all of these beautiful fruit trees, and they were a part of the acequia system, right? So they would get flood irrigated. I can't remember exactly how often, but being like a little kid, when the flood irrigation was happening, it just felt like the whole giant yard turned into like this awesome swimming pool for you. And we'd go get like banana splits at this little, ice cream place on the corner, and then like make little boats and race them through the irrigation ditches. And I think like Diego, I have a lot of memories of doing things like that with my grandfather, who passed away from pancreatic cancer in 2010. My grandparents were children when the Trinity nuclear bomb was detonated 45 miles away from Tularosa. A lot of elders in my family and in that community died of cancer, often that same kind of aggressive strain of pancreatic cancer that's associated with radiation exposure. That's actually one of the things that motivated me to go to law school, and kind of my first introduction to environmental justice, environmental injustice, really. But I think it's hard to think about how many elders have been taken from us unjustly, either because of environmental racism, other like health conditions that are due to economic disparities, and things like that. So like Diego said, there's so many things that I wish I could have asked and could have known to ask when I was younger, to my elders. But I also am really grateful for those memories with them, and for the things that I was able to share when I was younger. Look forward to being an elder one day if I'm lucky. So.
Thank you. Yes, Luis?
Jerry, there's a question on the chat.
Yes,
Put it forward.
yes, please.
So this is from Freddy Cabral. He says, thank you for coming to El Paso. I have a question. As a young Native leader of my community, what kind of advice any of you will give me to be a better leader, and what can I do to improve myself daily?
Marissa, you want to start with that one?
Sure. So in working with young people, the answer is not formulaic. How can any of us be a better leader? We have to figure out what our authentic voice feels like in us, in our bodies, and what are the ways that we can trust our teachings and trust our intuition to guide us in good ways, to trust our ceremonial or prayerful life to guide us in good ways. And what it looks like for any one of us to be a leader might be different than the next person. And so some people like being the leader that looks like a band director, And some people like being the leader that looks like someone that's at the back of the line herding ducklings. And any one of those ways of being a leader, if it's authentic to you, it's about the relationships that you cultivate with the people around you. And how do you help to move in ways that benefit the collective? And it looks different for everyone. And so what can we do in a daily practice? This might sound super nerdy. I'll share with you my notebook. This is a notebook that I carry everywhere. I journal and take notes chronologically for everything, no matter what it is. And I draw a lot. And part of the process is that when we think quietly in our heads, ideas come and go and they might disappear before you can grab them. But if you write them, you're activating a different part of your brain and you can make connections on the paper. They're not for anyone else, just for yourself. And if you draw them, even more so, you can make different kinds of connections because you're activating different parts of your brain. And so whether you're journaling what you're learning or journaling what you're thinking or journaling the soundscapes all around you that influence you or that resonate or that make meaning, I've taken even just a few notes about our conversation today because it's things that I want to hold on to and savor for a little while longer. And so I would say, what do I do personally? I take notes. I have about probably 20 notebooks. And it's all chronological of all of the meetings that I do. I'll just pull a new page. I always write in pencil. And these are just the tools for learning that I think are really straightforward, that also help to make connections and fortify things in my own mind so that when I do share with other people, hopefully there are some connections that make sense to me before I speak them.
Journaling is good leadership training. First, you get fine motor skills, and then everything else you've said. I relate to that person. I'm on edition 140 right now. My journal. Diego, do you have something to say to that question?
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer because I think it's a really good answer. And all I'll say is, yeah, like to be the best leader you can be, you have to be that person for yourself first, really. Being solid within yourself is going to be the most important thing for being a good leader, because when you truly know yourself and you know where you come from and you know your authentic voice, like Marissa shared, like that's the most important thing, because you could always speak truthfully based on what you know in your experience in whatever situation you need to be in, and you can show up as that person as well in whatever situation, and being able to confidently show up as that person who truly knows and nurtures and loves themselves fully is going to be the most important thing no matter what, because you got to make sure that that comes first, and from there you'll definitely be the best leader you needed to be.
Yeah, I'll just add a,
say to our guest question.
I'll just add something short that builds on both of those things. I think that being connected with your authentic self will also enable you to set boundaries that you need to be in relationship with others in like a healthy and sustainable way. I think Adrienne Lee Brown is the one who says the boundaries are the distance that I need to love you and myself at the same time, right? And I really love that representation of what that means. I think that not falling into patterns of self-sacrifice where you're not caring for yourself also end up harming your relationships with others. And I think people in leadership positions in a capitalist society where so much is expected of all of us can often fall into those patterns. So I'd say, caring for yourself first will enable you to be a better leader and have better relationships within your community.
Thank you. Well, we have 3 minutes. Need to draw things to a close here. And just to summarize, I mean, we started out talking about the historic and the recent roles of Native communities in water management. And we quickly were reminded that management is a Western analytical term that Indigenous peoples, as we interact with, live with, are part of, and draw identity from river, from water, from nature, and not necessarily from water management. I was especially moved to understand and hear about how you visualize and embody relationship to water, whether it's us as water in us, our feet on the ground with groundwater, sky water overhead for us. And conceiving of how life, we don't serve time. We're dependent on it, really. And the continuity that Indigenous people bring to our world.